And we are continuing our discussion of Campaign 2016 with our political analyst, Bill Nigut, with some of the exchanges from Wednesday night's debate. First of all, let's start by talking about Ben Carson. We've talked a lot about Carly Fiorina, Jeb Bush already, Donald Trump, obviously. Ben Carson had been surging prior to this debate, doing very, very well. Coming into the debate, obviously, he moves more to center stage on Wednesday. And yet, I don't think he necessarily had a very strong debate performance, didn't necessarily really mix it up with anyone. What say you?
Well, so here's the question about that. Voters seem to like the low-key, soft-spoken Ben Carson. So the question becomes, if Donald Trump can say just about anything and his supporters will still stand by him, can Ben Carson continue to have this low-key presence and at least hold on to the supporter he's got? Now, he probably didn't draw any new people on the debate Wednesday night, but I think he maintains his position as somebody who seems reasonable, intelligent, and I don't think he'll... I'll be interested if he suffers too much in the polls because
reasonable is probably a very good word to describe him, right? He seems like a reasonable guy. At the same time, people are still learning who he is. And one of the things he did, he's also shifted. During the first debate, he was asked about income tax and what would you do. And he came up with this thing about, I think we should tithe, right? 10%, which, let's face it, government is not God. The idea that I'm giving God 10%, fine. Giving government 10%, I don't know about that. But I think clearly his campaign looked at that and said, that's not a winning answer. So we need something. And I noticed he pivoted during Wednesday night's debate towards the flat tax, and he's now considering that.
You're absolutely right. It was an example, though, of maybe what's going to be a problem for him down the road is because he's willing to say out loud what most people on that stage were not, which is, well, I'm still weighing my options on this issue. I don't know what I really want to do about taxes. And, you know, we'll see how long he can sustain that sort of indecision, that ambivalence, and attract support.
Something else that jumped out was a discussion about Iraq, and obviously Donald Trump came out and said, by the way, once again, I'm the only guy on the stage who was vocal against the war in Iraq back in 2000. This time he said 3. He's been saying 2004 because that's when the interview was with Rolling Stone. But now he said, or Esquire magazine, excuse me, Esquire. And then he came back and said, now it's 2003. But then Ben Carson said this.
I just want to mention that when the issue occurred in 2003, I suggested to President Bush that he not go to war. Okay, so I just want that on the record.
By the way, most awkward high five in history.
Just terrible.
But Carson wanted to make that point. Rand Paul also made the point that he said, I have made a career out of being against the Iraq war. And so it was interesting because Trump's been using that line over and over, that Ben Carson made that point as well. How do you think that helps or hurts him in terms of the foreign policy debate?
I don't think it's going to hurt Trump at all.
No, Carson. No.
Oh, how it hurts Carson. You know, it's very hard for me to get a handle right now on where Carson's support is going to go. So, as an example, he was very low-key in the Fox debate, and there were people who afterwards said, well, Ben Carson didn't do himself any favors, but in fact he did, because there is something, again, about his sort of laid-back presence. He's so different that he's continuing, like a Trump, to draw support without being specific on an awful lot of issues.
Which seems to be okay with voters, and I think part of the reason for that is because voters look at those career politicians and Republicans and Democrats who have been in office all over the country, who are very specific on things they're going to do and then don't do anything.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So let's talk about, in terms of business acumen, you have Donald Trump obviously is saying, I'm worth $10 billion, I've done so well. Carly Fiorina, we talked about her a few minutes ago. The issues with HP, obviously there's a lot of discussion about her time there, her tenure there, and they had some back and forth up on the stage, specifically about kind of their careers and success. Let's listen to that.
You were forced to file for bankruptcy not once,
I never filed
not
for
twice,
bankruptcy.
4 times, a record 4 times. Why should we trust you to manage the finances of this nation any differently than you manage the finances of your casinos?
Yeah, and then Trump went on to say from there, attacked her on HP and said she would not be allowed to run any of my companies. Also said that HP still to this day is struggling to recover from her tenure there. Do you think the average person, because Chris Christie jumped in there also and said, hey, nobody cares about this stuff, they care about the middle class. Do they care about this stuff?
I don't think they do care about that stuff in terms of the business of HP at this point. I do think they care about who looks stronger in that exchange. Did Carly Fiorina give it back to Trump as well as she took it from him? And if so, are people going to say, gee, maybe she's a really strong candidate we ought to get behind? I don't think the Trump supporters worried about that one way or the other, but you're right. the person who got the most out of that exchange was Chris Christie, who really did do a great job jumping in and saying, why are you arguing? Who cares? Well, you're great business people. What about the poor middle class American out there?
And I just don't think you're going to be able to make the argument that Donald Trump is not successful.
Right.
I mean, you're just not going to be able to. And what he always says to that accusation that, well, you've had issues along the way is, I worked the system.
Right.
The system allowed me to basically take these cuts and to, whether he filed for bankruptcy or however he did it, basically he worked the system to make his money, as many very wealthy people do. And I think he's very open about that, and I think voters like it.
Right.
The other comment that was made, and it was, I mean, about as cheesy as you can get, but a guy from Wisconsin made it, so why not? Let's listen to Scott Walker.
Mr. Trump, we don't need an apprentice in the White House. We don't need an apprentice in the White House. We have one right now. He told us all the things we wanted to hear back in 2008. We don't know who you are or where you're going. We need someone who can actually get the job done.
Yeah, we don't need an apprentice in the White House. I mean, it was again, one of these lines. And guys, can you re-rack that? Because I want to play that again in a second. But Scott Walker, it seemed like another one of those lines he's sitting on, just waiting to use it, right? His team wrote it and said, this is brilliant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, poor Scott Walker. Look, he is struggling mightily. There was a while when he was the golden boy of the Republican Party, a guy who was going to be in the top tier. And now he's fallen off, although we can't discount him in Iowa. He still has potential to come back there. But the reality is, in the room after the debate, in the spin room as they call it, Walker was going around to every news outlet he could find to say it was because I was tough against Trump at the very beginning that it set the tone for everybody being tough on Trump. He was doing the best he could.
Yeah, which is untrue. But I want to play it again, though, and I want you this time to watch.
Okay.
Not Scott Walker. Watch Jeb Bush's face to that.
Mr. Trump, we don't need an apprentice in the White House. We don't need an apprentice in the White House. We have one right now. He told us all the things we wanted to hear back in 2008. We don't know who you are or where you're going. We need someone who can actually get the job done.
To me, Jeb's face looks like, I wish I had thought of that line, right? How come my people didn't write that down? I mean, it seemed like it was a little bit, just felt so contrived. All right, we're going to have much more about this. We'll talk about the Democratic presidential candidates. They're not getting as much conversation, but much more about them when we come back.